I've been away from my channel for a couple of months, but I'm back now, and you can expect new videos from me on a regular basis again. As I know that for the majority of you, history talks are your favorites, I decided to make an introduction to the history of the Ottoman Empire. So what we're going to do in the next minutes is explore the very tumultuous history of one of the largest empires ever. I have plenty of things to tell you, so try to adopt a comfortable position. I'm going to show you a few maps, as usual, but you will be perfectly able to follow without seeing them, so you can close your eyes if you wish to. And we're going to travel together through the centuries. To begin with, who are the Ottomans? They are not a people. The Ottomans are a dynasty. A dynasty initially at the head of a Turkic tribe. And to understand that better, we need to talk a little bit about who are the Turks and where they come from. The Turks are an ethnic and linguistic group of peoples coming from Central Asia, and from there they migrated in various directions. Nowadays they still represent the vast majority of the population in Central Asia, in countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and they also represent significant minorities in countries like China, especially in the western part of China. There is a minority called the Uyghurs, who are apparented to this Turkic ethnic and linguistic group in Siberia too, and they also migrated towards the west, towards Turkey and the Middle East. Their languages are apparented. They have also preserved a few common cultural traits, but it's very difficult to say that one person is a Turk, because ethnically they have mixed with other populations, and even though they share common origins, they look extremely different. For example, the Uyghurs or the inhabitants of Kazakhstan look very Asian, whereas the inhabitants of Turkey look more Caucasian or Mediterranean, as a result of several centuries-long mix with the populations they found when they arrived in this region. And when they reached this region called Anatolia, that corresponds to the western part of Turkey, the Turks were actually just one of the waves of invasion, of migration, that was benefiting from the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. So once again, let's move back in time several centuries before the arrival of the Turks to the last decades of the Roman Empire. You may know that by the end of its existence, the Roman Empire, which had Rome as its capital, had to be separated into two empires. There was a Western Empire that retained Rome as the capital, and it included Italy, France, Spain, the north of Africa, and there was an Eastern Empire with a new capital, a city called Constantinople, The city had been founded on the site of an ancient Greek city called Byzantium. So Byzantium and Constantinople are actually the same city with a different name, and today this city still exists under the name of Istanbul. It was the capital of the Ottoman Empire for centuries and remains the most important city in Turkey, even though the political capital has been moved to Ankara in the center of Turkey. After the split of the Roman Empire, the western part quickly collapsed due to barbarian invasions, especially Germanic tribes coming from the north of Europe, but the Eastern Empire survived, and Byzantium during centuries remained one of the most important political organizations in the world. It was very powerful, had very strong armies, and managed to more or less maintain during the Middle Age the territory it had inherited from the Roman Empire. The history of Byzantium is another story. Maybe I'll make a video about that one day. But in the following centuries, Byzantium started to lose ground, facing invaders, and especially the expansion of the Arabs, starting with the expansion of Islam in the 7th century. Byzantium lost to the Arabs Egypt and all of its territories in Africa, large parts of the Middle East too, the region of Mesopotamia that corresponds to Iraq today. As usual, just a remark, I'm going to put links to other related videos in the description below, and if you are interested in all of that, that could include the videos about Babylon or the history of Venice. So, during the Middle Age, Byzantium entered a period of decay. There were reactions, and sometimes Byzantium was able to get back some of its territories, but there was a centuries-long decline of this empire, threatened on most of its borders in the Balkans by the rise of Venice too, by the invaders coming from Asia, so that by the late Middle Age, Byzantium had lost about all its territories and had been reduced, even though it was still officially an empire, and been reduced to the region around the city of Constantinople and a few other territories in Greece. The Ottomans, this dynasty at the head of their tribe, had settled in western Anatolia, very close to Constantinople, and was one of the main invaders that contributed to dismantle the Byzantine Empire. The man considered the founder of the Ottoman dynasty and state was called Osman, Osman Bey or Osman I, and during the 14th century, a period that corresponds to the late Middle Age in Europe, he expanded, and his successors too, the territories controlled by the Ottomans to more and more territory in western Anatolia, western Turkey, before starting to move to Europe, to the Balkans, and conquering a large part of Greece. Their capital, which was initially the city of Iznik in the west of Turkey, was moved several times to another more important city called Bursa, still in the 14th century. In this region where the power of Byzantium was vanishing, the Ottomans did not only conquer territories, they also organized them with a very centralized and efficient administration, and they put in place a political organization that would last for centuries until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the 20th century. For example, the institution of the Divan, which was some sort of parliament or council that the sovereign could use to rule his state, even though it was an autocracy. Also, the institution of the Grand Vizier, the equivalent to a prime minister dealing with day-to-day business in managing the administration. The army was particularly important, obviously, and the Ottomans had excellent military tactics. They also founded a very famous army corps called the Janissaries. The Janissaries were infantry units, elite units, that were trained with a very strict discipline, and at the beginning recruited from slaves, young Christian boys that were captured in the territories that previously belonged to the Byzantine Empire. They were converted to Islam and contributed to many victories in the Ottoman expansion at the expense of Byzantium. The corps later changed in nature in the following centuries, and belonging to the Janissaries became eventually hereditary in the 17th century. It became extremely corrupt and had a strong control and impact on the political life inside the Ottoman Empire, and the Janissaries were considered one of the reasons of the decay of the empire centuries later. But in the 14th century, they were the spearhead of the Ottoman expansion, and this expansion at the expense of Byzantium culminated in the 15th century, in 1453 precisely, when the chief of the Ottomans, the Sultan called Mehmet II, captured Constantinople after a long siege and terminated the existence of the Byzantine Empire that had existed for 1000 years. The city was later renamed Istanbul and still has this name today, and it became the new capital of the Ottoman Empire until the fall of the Ottomans and the proclamation of the Turkish Republic in the 20th century, in 1923 precisely. This date of 1453, with the fall of Constantinople, is sometimes considered by historians like the end of the Middle Age and the beginning of a new era, even though in history evolutions are more progressive. Nothing changes just from one day to the next, but it's true that in 1453 very important events happened, not only in this part of the world with the death of Byzantium, but also in the western part of Europe, because this is also the official date for the end of the 100 Years' War between England and France, which meant that the two countries could now move on from this conflict. But the fall of Byzantium, the capture of Constantinople, and the new capital were just the beginning for the Ottoman expansion, because it was going to take another dimension in the second half of the 15th century and the 16th century. The Ottomans secured their control over Greece and the western part of Turkey, starting to move towards the east of Turkey and then the rest of the Middle East, so much that by the 1510s the Ottomans seized control of Egypt and became indisputably the leading force, the leading state in the Muslim world. And to illustrate this domination and reinforce it, the Ottoman kings claimed the title of Caliph, which in the Muslim world is a title of political and religious leadership. The Caliph is supposed to be the head of the religious community, of the community of Islam, also known as the Ummah, and the Ottoman sovereigns retained this title of Caliph until the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Even though Islam was and always remained the official, the state religion in the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans were famous for their relative tolerance in terms of religion, maybe because their very fast expansion meant that their empire always was a patchwork of different peoples, of different beliefs and religions, and it would have been impossible to impose one single religion to everyone. So the non-Muslims, and especially the Christians and the Jews within the Ottoman Empire, had a particular status. They had to pay an additional tax for not being Muslims, but they were left free to practice their religion. And this is why, if you look at a religious map of the Balkans today, despite centuries of Ottoman rule in this region, the Muslims are still very little represented, except in particular regions like Bosnia. But if you look at Greece, for example, which has been under Ottoman rule for centuries, the Christian tradition of this country remains very strong. Shortly after the conquest of Syria and Egypt in 1520, began the rule of maybe the most famous of all Ottoman sultans, Suleiman, also known as Suleiman the Magnificent in Western countries. His rule, that lasted for more than 40 years, really corresponds to the Golden Age of the Ottoman Empire, a period of very fast expansion, during which in the Mediterranean world and all around the frontiers of the Ottoman Empire, the name Ottoman was a synonym of invincibility on battlefields, of expansion, power, wealth, and during the reign of Suleiman, the empire continued to expand to the coasts of Arabia, to Iraq, to North Africa and the Balkans. The Ottomans did not always annex territories. Sometimes they vassalized smaller states without ruling them directly, but through this process of vassalization, they ensured their control over very large regions. In the east, too, they conquered towards Persia, Iran, the Caucasus. They established their presence on the north shore of the Black Sea, so that on 3 continents, and with a population of about 15 million inhabitants, which was huge for this time, the Ottoman Empire became one of the greatest powers of his time. The Golden Age of the Ottoman Empire is not only about conquest. I mentioned before the very efficient administration that the empire had put in place. There is also a very rich artistic and architectural heritage from this period. The most famous architect from the 16th century is a man called Sinan, and he created some of the most beautiful mosques in the Ottoman Empire, including in Istanbul. If you have a chance to visit the city, you will have a chance to see some of the most beautiful and impressive examples of religious architecture in the Muslim world. And it's interesting to see how the Ottomans mixed the Muslim Arab tradition with the heritage of Byzantium. For example, the Turkish mosques have a very particular architecture, inspired for a part by the architecture of churches and basilics that existed in the Byzantine Empire prior to the conquest. In Istanbul, one of the most famous monuments is Hagia Sophia, one of the largest religious buildings in the world, built centuries ago during the Byzantine Empire, that was turned into a mosque after the conquest. It is no longer a mosque today. It has been transformed into a museum, and it is opened to the public. It is no longer a religious building. And the other large mosques in Istanbul or other cities in Turkey are directly inspired by the architecture, with very impressive domes of the greatest basilic of the Byzantine Empire. With the rise of the Ottomans and the control they had seized over the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea and the Balkans, the rivalry with European powers became extremely fierce, and in particular with the Habsburgs. I talked about the Habsburgs in various previous videos that I made. You remember that the Habsburgs are a dynasty that rose to prominence in Europe in the 16th century, ruling at the same time Austria, the Netherlands, Spain, and its colonial empire in the Americas that was expanding extremely fast and bringing considerable wealth to Spain. And during most of the 16th century, the Habsburgs and the Ottomans would be at war, be it in the Mediterranean Sea or in the Balkans. In 1529, the city of Vienna, the capital of Austria, was besieged by the Ottomans. Ultimately, the city was not taken, but for Austria in particular, which was exposed to the direct contact with Ottoman power in the Balkans, the Turks were a terrible threat. Another fierce enemy of the Ottomans was Venice, which was declining in the 16th century as a commercial and economic powerhouse because the Ottoman expansion had cut its commercial routes with the Middle East, and thanks to their geographic position, the Ottomans could control the very lucrative trade with Asia and the Middle East that had contributed to the wealth of Venice. And one of the most famous and significant events in this war for the control of the Mediterranean Sea was the naval battle of Lepanto in 1571. This was a massive naval battle, maybe the most important since the Battle of Actium 15 centuries before, in which Mark Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by August. And in this battle, hundreds of galleys gathered by the Ottomans on the one hand, and Spain, Venice, and other Italian states fought. It turned out to be a victory for the Christians, and one that had a very strong impact in the west of Europe, because for the first time in a large military engagement, they had won against the Turks that until the Battle of Lepanto had a reputation of being invincible. But still, by the end of the 16th century, the Ottomans were still one of the greatest powers in the world, and their expansion seemed to have no limit. However, in the 17th century, the empire entered a period of stagnation that even turned into decline in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are various reasons for this stagnation and the stop to the Ottoman expansion. Some of them are political. Until the end of the 16th century, the Ottomans had very capable and brilliant sovereigns. This came to an end, and they had a long string of rulers with much less capability to control the country and impose their decisions to an empire that had become so large that it became difficult to administrate. And bit by bit, the sultans from Istanbul lost control over the most remote parts of their empire, where the local administrators, the beys, that were the heads, the chiefs of provinces, had a lot of independence, and it made it difficult for the central power to concentrate the financial and human resources that their empire previously offered. There was also a lot of corruption internally at every level of the administration, and I mentioned earlier the case of the Janissaries that were initially a military corps that turned into a powerhouse within the empire, controlling the sultans directly and trying to obtain advantages for themselves at the expense of the general interest. Sometimes they assassinated sultans when they considered they did not serve their interests well enough. But there were also more structural reasons: a technical decline. The Ottomans, during their Golden Age, had the most modern and well-organized armies in Europe and probably in the world. This changed when technical progress accelerated in Western Europe, and when the armies of countries like Austria, Spain, France, England became much more modern and better organized than the Ottoman armies, including in the 18th century the Russian army that had been modernized by Peter the Great, and Russia emerged as another threat to Ottoman power with its desire to expand towards the south, towards the Black Sea and the Balkans. There was also an economic decline that started as early as the 16th century, when the Europeans, mainly the Portuguese and the Spanish, discovered new commercial routes around Africa or towards the Americas, helping them to control the wealth produced by trade at the expense of the Middle East, that was no longer the crossroads of international trade routes, because the European powers had managed to take control over international trade. Faced with all these threats and problems, the empire really accelerated its decline in the second half of the 18th century, starting to lose territories at the periphery. During the wars of the French Revolution, they lost control over Egypt, that was conquered by a French expedition and then by the British. But even before, the control of Istanbul over the province was very loose, because the local beys, the local chiefs, tended to become more and more independent and feel less and less respect for the central power. After the wars of the Revolution in the 19th century, the empire was faced with a terrible time bomb for it, the problem of nationalities. Until the 19th century, many states could have a collection of different nationalities, and the desire for national independence was pretty limited. But with the propagation of nationalism in many parts of the world, the 19th century saw the emergence of a very strong desire for national independence, and being a multinational state, the Ottoman Empire was absolutely unable to adjust to this new reality, which provoked many revolutions or insurgencies in the Balkans in particular. And the most symbolic loss for the Ottomans in the 19th century is probably the independence of Greece in 1830. In the 1820s, an insurgency began in Greece in favor of independence, and this demand for independence was supported by the public opinion and ultimately the governments in countries like Russia, England, France, so that ultimately the Ottomans that were unable to oppose this international coalition against them had to grant independence to Greece. But they also lost most of their territories in the Balkans during this period, either with the appearance of new states like Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, for example, or to the power of Austria-Hungary that remained the main power in the Balkanic region. By the end of the 19th century, the empire was commonly called the sick man of Europe and was clearly considered by everyone to be just the shadow of what it used to be. It had fallen militarily and needed to call military advisors from various countries, in particular from Germany, and in the first years of the 20th century, in an effort to try and modernize the army, modernize the economy, the Ottomans strengthened their relation diplomatically and economically with Germany, which would lead the two countries to be allies in the First World War. From being a leading world power 3 centuries before, the empire had turned into a prey for the imperialism of countries like Germany, Britain, France, and its economy was falling more and more under control of foreign capital. The railways, the banks, the very small industry that had begun to appear but remained very underdeveloped was more and more under foreign control, which meant that the empire was really just the shadow of what it used to be, and everybody was expecting its collapse or the continuation of its decline. The perception of this decline had also strong internal consequences and undermined the social cohesion within what remained of the Ottoman Empire that still controlled a significant part of the Middle East. The central power started to distrust minorities and sometimes see them as agents of foreign powers, and this would lead to terrible consequences during the First World War, with minorities and in particular the Armenians being deported and exterminated in what is probably the first genocide in history, even though the actual Turkish government still refuses to acknowledge this. The empire was therefore living its last moments, and the First World War would mark really the beginning of the end for what remained of the Ottoman Empire. When the First World War began, the Ottomans were on the side of the Central Powers, together with Germany and Austria-Hungary, facing the Allies, mainly Russia, the UK and France. The war took place mainly on two fronts, the Eastern Front between Russia and Germany and Austria, and the Western Front between France, Britain and Germany. However, the Ottomans controlled the strait between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and in order to try to take control of it, an expedition was sent by the Allies, mainly with troops coming from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and a few French too, and they landed in a place called Gallipoli, where a terribly bloody and ultimately useless battle took place. This was the largest military fight in which the Ottomans were involved during the First World War. But internally, the country was falling into chaos. This is during this period, in the years 1915, 716 that the Armenian genocide took place, as mentioned before, and other minorities too were displaced and sometimes exterminated, so that when the First World War ended with the victory of the Allies, the Ottoman Empire was just close to complete dislocation. It lost all of its territories outside Turkey and the very small European part that remained around Istanbul, according to a plan decided by the French and the British. Syria and Lebanon went to France, whereas Iraq and Palestine went to the UK, so that the Ottoman frontiers were reduced to the modern frontiers of Turkey. The empire was discredited, unable to reform, and in 1923 it was finally terminated and replaced by the Republic of Turkey, which remains today the state of Turkey as we know it. Well, as usual, there would be many more things to say, but I already spoke more than 40 minutes, so I'm going to stop here for today. And as usual, I hope you found this moment interesting, if you are still with me, and I hope to see you soon for another video.